From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
I'm Gwen Kirkpatrick from the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at Georgetown University. It's actually Spanish and Portuguese in Catalan.
Wonderful.
And I'm honored to participate in the National Book Festival hosted by the Library of Congress throughout its 16 years of existence. And I'd also like to give a special thanks to the Hispanic Reading Room of the Library of Congress and its amazing staff and a long history. We also want to thank the co-chairman of the festival, David Rubenstein, and the many National Book Festival sponsors who made this event possible. We also especially want to thank the Embassy of Spain and Spain Arts and Culture, who have a beautiful house on 16th Street with many wonderful events. You too can support the festival with the gift of a donation. Just check your program and on the app. The festival would not be possible without the support of sponsors and book lovers. Just ask you a favor, if you have a cell phone, make sure it's turned off. We'll have a question and answer after the author's presentation, so you can save your questions until then. And please be aware that your questions and answers will be filmed and conserved. Carlos will also be available for book signing from 2:30 to 3:30 on the lower level. Okay, from the size of the audience, I see you know who Carlos Ruiz Zafón is, but I'm going to go through my little paragraph anyway. Carlos Ruiz Zafón, originally from Barcelona, is an internationally acclaimed author whose works have been translated into more than 50 languages. More importantly, he is one of the world's most read novelists. His literary career began in 1993 with The Prince of Mist, which was followed by The Midnight Palace and September Lights. Those three are available as the Mist trilogy, and then The Haunting Maria. In 2001, he published his first novel for adults. The others were for young adults like me. I love Marina. The Shadow of the Wind, which soon became an international literary phenomenon. With The Angel's Game of 2008, he returned to the universe of the Cemetery of Lost Books, which grew further with The Prisoner of Heaven, 2011. And this November, I understand, he will publish another volume of this group called Labyrinth of the Spirits.
The very last
but
one.
In Spanish.
El laberinto de los espíritus.
And as you know, his works have won many prizes, and he has millions of readers. Okay, so now.
That's my exemplary life.
Right. A question. All readers and critics have praised your storytelling abilities, the strong plots and the strong characterizations. Why is it that the world still needs stories and needs stories in series?
Well, I think storytelling is one of our natural instincts. We communicate through stories, through sequences. The human brain can only absorb that can be structured as a sequence of events, of ideas. And naturally, at some point, because this is how we think, this is the software of our brain, at some point, the instinct to tell stories, to take that and transform it, so to speak, into an art, in trying to understand ourselves, our experiences, the world we inhabit, to communicate through fiction, through creations, through ideas, through symbols, evolved. And it has existed in every single culture. It has reached many different mediums, and no matter how many technological changes, cultural changes we go through, the need to communicate, and the need to generate stories that can be stories about the real world, can be narratives, persists. So in a way, literature, what it is trying to take that and try to create an art of storytelling, trying to work with language in a way which is not merely functional, but allows us to explore all these classic themes in human nature, in our history, in our world, and try to create a narrative around imaginary worlds, characters that speaks and engages us. And I think it's one of our most natural and direct instincts that will always exist in some way or another.
And so much of the world's literature exists as oral stories.
That's how they began.
Huge amounts, still, many parts of the world. You've talked about continuing the 19th century Gothic genre in some novels, or modifications of it, I think it's, with its mysteries, monsters, and dark palaces or mansions. We have a lot of mysterious monsters in contemporary television and films, often set in remote times. Why is this so appealing to the public, especially to the young public?
Well, I think that the narrative of the fantastic, the monsters, imaginary worlds, all these elements are just elements in storytelling. I think it's only recently, through the 20th century, that the marketing of storytelling has forced us to consider different niches or different segments and to create genres for the purpose of marketing them differently. And we call something fantasy and science fiction and horror and mystery and literary fiction, whatever the hell that means. So we have, you know, all these different labels that make sense from a marketing point of view. But from a storytelling point of view, all these elements have been combined together since the early stages of storytelling, from oral storytelling to the written word to audiovisual storytelling, and they exist. And when I think what is appealing about these elements, for instance, elements in the Gothic, the sense that you can transform and take elements of the fantastic, of the atmosphere, of many things, and give them a new meaning, use the symbols and empower them to provide a dramatic function inside the plot, inside the story, that may not have if we were treating them from a purely naturalistic point of view. And I think this is what makes them so powerful and also so hard to use well, because they are like big weapons that can easily, if they're not managed well, they can fire back at you. But if they're well used, I think this is why the tradition of the fantastic that goes back centuries. You know, if for instance, you take an example that everybody knows, William Shakespeare, the plays of Shakespeare are filled with monsters, with ghosts, with the prodigious, with mysteries, with elements, and he combines all that stuff. Is it because it's a ghost story? Hamlet is a ghost story? Not necessarily. It's a tragedy. It's a great story about human nature, about the human condition, but he uses all of these elements as devices to tell the story, to give a specific power to symbolism. And I think this is why if these devices of the fantastic are well used, they continue to resonate with audiences because there's a point of them, not because the audience believes that these things are real. Yeah, they're, you know, right here in the mall, dragons and elves and things like that. No, but if we use this kind of elements and vampires or ghosts or stories or haunted houses or whatever, these things, I think, allow us to tell more and tell more intensely and reach into the atavic elements that are in the minds of readers or in the audience. And this is why they're so interesting and so rich.
But your monsters are not, say, we have a lot of blockbuster movies where the monsters are like robots. They're highly technological, and a lot of your monsters are...
Yeah, they don't run on batteries.
They don't run on batteries. They're incredibly physical. Could you just talk? I was thinking about that in Marina.
Yeah, Marina.
The monsters, they have the wood and secret and plants
Yeah,
and
well,
slime.
one of the things I've been trying to do for now, I was very intrigued by the storytelling and especially the Gothic novels of the 19th century, the great tradition of the great novelists of the 19th century. And ever since I was a child, I tried to figure out how these narratives were built. And in a way, so to speak, to reverse engineer them and say, how do they do this? And what I was interested is in trying to get this grand tradition, all these fantastic writers from Wilkie Collins to Dickens to all the great writers of the 19th century, and say, would it be possible to take this model of a storytelling, which is the birth of modern storytelling? Most of the early grammar of film comes from 19th century novels. The structural way, the use of time, the use of plots and subplots, everything comes from there. But at the time, of course, the readers, the audience for instance, the audience of Dickens was an immensely popular writer in his day.
Newspapers.
It was published in installment, in magazines, in newspapers. He was making it up as it went. The versions of Dickens we read today are kind of laboring. When he finished the famous 3-tome novel was something that he had to go back and try to match things up, because they never match as they had been published originally, because he was making up these huge stories week after week. And so eventually
with the deadline.
Oh yeah, with a deadline. But this created this kind of serialized storytelling, the way of trying to hold your audience interest. I think there was something very interesting to me in this model, and what I've been trying to do for many years, and I started doing that in Marina, is could it be possible to deconstruct this model, this type of storytelling, and rebuild it as if it were a new engine, but incorporating all the things we've learned through the 20th century in terms of storytelling, which are many. Through the 20th century, both storytellers and audiences have become extremely sophisticated. In a way, it's like we could speak about a technology of storytelling. In the way that technology has evolved, what we've learned about how people absorb codes, how they can interpret different language, how they can be stimulated in many different ways. And we've learned this through movies, through television, through advertising, through graphic design, through comic books, through literature, through many different genres, through modernist fiction, through genre fiction, to mystery, from noir, from all these things. We've learned many different things about the technology, the technique of how can we tell a story in a more efficient and intense way. So what I wanted to do is, would it be possible for me to try to take all these things, all these devices, all these techniques, and recombine them in trying to bring back the classic tradition of storytelling from the 19th century novels, which is about the classical themes of literature of all time, and try to reinvent this in a way that stimulated modern readers in all of these different decoders that now we have in our brains, because we've grown up watching TV, watching movies, reading comic books, reading different types of fiction, seeing journalism, saying many different things. So we have built in, without we even realizing from childhood, all these little decoders in our brains that a reader of Dickens never had. A reader of Dickens had never seen a movie, had never seen TV, barely had seen any theater, barely had been exposed to many forms of storytelling. Nowadays in our world, we don't even realize how sophisticated we are as audiences. So I thought, could it be possible to bridge this thing for an audience that can be stimulated from many different angles and try to use the classical themes of literature, but with all of that we've learned. And this was something that I've been trying to move in that direction for a long time. Marina was the first attempt to try to do this. And then the quartet of the World of Cemetery of Forgotten Books, The Shadow of the Wind, The Angel's Game, and so forth, is what I've been really trying to implement this, try to do this attempt to get closer to this ideal.
We're smarter than we know.
You didn't know about that. Well, now you're looking into the kitchen. This is what happens when you step into the kitchen. Say, I didn't know you put this crap into what I'm eating. Say, well, if you step into the kitchen, you're going to find out too much information. So you either stay there in the dining room and you don't know what you're eating. It tastes good, don't ask. But if you want to know what goes into the pot, hey, it's your choice. So now you know.
Okay.
I know it sounds very pretentious and very laborious and like it's a laboratory, and then the technology of the 19th century sounds like some kind of steampunk stuff. And it's just storytelling. I think it's the job of a novelist, of a storyteller, to figure these things out and then to present them in a seamless way in which when you're reading, you're just flowing through the text as if it were water. You're immersing yourself in the imagery, in the characters, in the world you're telling, and you are not seeing all the technicalities. It's like when you cross the Golden Gate Bridge, you don't think about mathematics. But it's about mathematics. That's why it's a glorious piece of engineering.
They knew.
Or the Cathedral of Cologne. That thing centuries ago it was designed so when you walk in, people would go and say, oh my God, this is the house of God. And they would be humbled by the monumental structure. And that's how they thought in emotional terms. But the Cathedral of Cologne, it's about mathematics and engineering. And it's a prodigious feat that even to this day, it's so impressive. Imagine that in the 13th century. So I'm putting this parallel between engineering or technicality of architecture and literature because I think they're very close. You build something that in nature is very technical, but the reader should never realize about it. It should feel easy, simple, something that you enjoy and you are not aware of how it was done.
One of your main characters wants to be an architect.
Yeah, there's one in Marina. There's a parallel in which he dreams of becoming an architect, and by the end of the book, he inherits this mission in which Marina was trying to write a book that she will be never able to. So he takes upon himself to finish the task. So he was dreaming of becoming an architect, and he will be an architect, but an architect of the story that Marina leaves in his hands.
Your first 4 novels were called young adult novels, but there are similarities with some of the later novels. Some of the same things reappear, young orphans or young people who might as well be orphaned. They're alone in the world, unanchored. A particular attention to old people, I think, really moving portraits of older people, older than I am, mystery, and the presence of real evil in the world. And I suppose the question is, why for young adult novels?
Well, the ugly truth, it was an accident. I never meant to write for young adults. I was hoping to, at some point, I always knew I wanted to be a writer. I wanted to make a living writing stories, writing books, and that was my calling. And when I was 4 years old, if you ask me, kids want to be an astronaut, a soccer star, or a psychopath or something, I was saying, no, I want to be an author, I want to be a writer. And for me, it was very clear. The only thing was, how do I convince the world that this is such a clear thing? And it took me a few years. So until I was maybe in my mid-20s or so, I had to make a living doing other things that had a lot to do with storytelling, but were not novels. But at some point I managed to do that, and I became, when I was 20-something, a full-time writer, and that's what I've been doing for my entire adult life. And the thing is, why that? I had written a number of novels that I didn't publish. There's some monstrous things that you have to write to learn your craft, and nobody should ever read, should be burned. But I always thought that you had to earn your right. Time is limited. So if you have the enormously pretentious sense that you deserve other people's time, that what you write is worth other people's time, you should work as hard as you can to provide the best you can to them, because say, I'm going to take a few hours out of your life, so I better earn it. So I wrote this novel for young adults because at the time I thought it was a good idea, whatever. I had written a number of novels that I didn't want to publish. And this book that was my first published book, called The Prince of Mist, El Príncipe de la Niebla, I won a big award in Spain for young adult literature. And because of that, and because the book became quite successful, and I found success in a field that I had never expected to, and I was aware of how hard it was to survive as a writer. You see it around you, and all writers are like people. It's like an abyss, and people are hanging from a thread, like in cheap movies where you see the rope is going like, and everybody's looking to see who's next. And down there are the snake pit. And at some point, somebody snaps, and they fall you never even hit, it never hits the bottom. It's like, oh my God, I'm going next. So you become very much aware of how hard it is just to survive as a novelist. So because I had found success in that field, I became very conservative, and I didn't want to leave. I was scared to leave. So I pretended to be a writer for young adults. I don't even know to this day what that means.
I don't either.
What is a young adult?
I like the young adult.
It's an adult, it's a child. I don't know, to me they're readers. Some of them are 8 years old, some of them are 90 years old. I don't care. I don't ask for them for a driving license. I don't card people. And I found 15-year-olds were immensely more mature than people that you need to do the carbon test to know where they're from. So it's like, I don't care. I don't care about that. But at some point, there's what we were saying about marketing labels. So I wrote 3 books that could pass for young adults. To me, they were just gothic, supernatural adventures, some kind of reinvention of Victorian old ghost stories. That's what I was trying to do. But then I realized that I was kind of betraying myself, saying, I found success in this, I'm doing well, but this is not the kind of book I want to write. So at some point I needed to, so Marina was a little bit of a bridge between the world of the books I wanted to write and the books I had been writing. So it's the book in which I realized that I could not pretend anymore. I told my publisher at the time, I'm working on something, but it's not going to be for you. So what do you mean? Well, boy. And by the end of Marina, I knew that I could not go back to writing a genre, not because there's anything wrong with it. I think it's a fantastic genre in which it creates readers, invites young people to read and to consider the wonders of all the fun, all the pleasure, all the wonderful things they can find in the world of books. So these books have an importance. They have to be decent so people are engaged and become readers for life. But I knew that I didn't really have the stuff to do that. So I tried to veer into what I felt were the kind of books I wanted to write. And the first one that was, for the first time I'm going to give myself the chance to do what I always wanted to do, and maybe I'll fail or not, but at least I think I've earned, after a few years of decent success as a young adult novelist, and then that was Shadow of the Wind. Marina is somewhere in between, because it was the place where I was trying to figure out how to use my roots, my memories, my own city, Barcelona, and try to how to shape. At some point, I think it happens to all writers. You want to go back home in a way and try to use all that stuff. At first, you need some distance, and I put some distance. My first 3 novels happened. One is in the south of the coast of England during World War II, the other in Calcutta, and the third one could have happened in the Moon. It just happened in Normandy in France, places that were kind of far away. So for the 4th one, say, the time has come for me to go back home and try to figure out this thing. And I started using Barcelona in trying to use it as a character, not as a backdrop, and try to create a character out of the city that to me represented what is the soul of the city, an old city with many secrets, with a dramatic history. And I came out with this kind of gothic, noirish Barcelona, which has many secrets and old palaces and all that stuff. I try to create a character. It's not the real Barcelona, even though if you go there, you can see it and you can find it. And I was interested in grounding it in fact. Most of the structures I'm mentioning and everything, usually it's real, it's there. You can go and touch the stones of these places. But the whole thing is heavily stylized. It's seen through, it's a stage in a way that gives them this additional atmosphere. So that was a little bit the journey I had from writing books in which I had found success, but were not my kind of material, to just, try to be myself as a writer, which at some point you just find what's your voice, what is your register. And that was with, I think, in part with Marina. And then it allowed me, in a way, I felt that I was able then to tackle the kind of work I wanted to do, which began with Shadow of the Wind and the cycle of the Cemetery of Forgotten Books.
Right. Well, you took my Barcelona question, so I go to another one.
Always do that.
In 2008, I read an interview in which you said that 99% of the best writing was being done for television and films.
Well, that has to be, that comes from an interview that was heavily doctored. These were not the words.
Oh.
Yeah, sometimes it happens that when you do print interviews, usually if you say something on TV or on the radio, it's your words. Nobody can put words in your mouth. Sometimes if you do a print interview, sometimes either there's a mistake in the or something maliciously somebody puts you because it sounds very provocative and it's going to sound like you're saying everybody is an idiot, ha ha ha, and they put that in the headline, and you are never said that, so why would I say something as stupid as that? What I said about this, and I'm sorry about becoming, because I've been hearing crap about that interview for ages, because people say, do you really believe that? Say, I never said that. It's a, why would anybody say that? It's just idiocy. What I said that in the last few years, a lot of the best storytelling, not the best literature, a lot of the best storytelling had been seen in mediums where maybe 20 years ago we were not looking for. And mainly it was television and cable television. And to this day, I think, if not 99%, I think that over the last 10, 15 years, in which mostly cable outlets have granted the power of creative control to writers, we've seen a wealth of TV series that are extraordinary. And I think even though I'm in the book business, I have to acknowledge that. You know, a lot of the best storytelling today, not all of it, but a lot of the best storytelling is done by very talented dramatists working very hard and creating TV series. For how long this will depend, if the economic model that has it made possible, it's viable, it will continue. If not, it will disappear. So.
You yourself are a script writer.
I bought my freedom, though.
You bought your freedom.
Yeah, I'm like those Roman slaves that they bought their freedom after working for the master for a while. I used to work as a screenwriter many years ago. It lasted for a few years. It was a spectacularly unsuccessful career in which I wrote things, or mostly rewrote things that never were produced, which is what happens to most screenwriters. You get hired to write something that will never get done. And usually you're rewriting somebody else. At some point you get fired and somebody rewrites you. And you make some money and you sit there, and at some point you say, what the hell am I doing with my life? So you learn many things about, along the way, some things about storytelling, other things about the nature of the film business and about human nature, which you could do without. But you know, I guess it's useful information that at some point, if you're going to join organized crime, now you know how it works. So, and so I worked for a while, and around the time I started working on Shadow of the Wind, I was working on a rewrite about, I don't know, an absurd project for a producer, and I asked him to fire me. Say, you know, you and me know you're going to fire me eventually. Why don't you fire me now, pay me off? You do me a great favor. And he said, whatever, you go write your art book or whatever that is, get it out of your system, and then you come back. I'll say, I'll do that. Luckily, Shadow of the Wind did very well, and so I kind of bought my freedom not to have to be a screenwriter anymore, which is not to put down the labor of screenwriters, because there are fantastic writers and dramatists working as screenwriters, and a lot of them got the chance finally to show their chops on TV, because now they were granted creative control, while in the film industry you have zero creative control as a writer. You're just a hired hand, and you're chewed upon and spit through the other door.
Well, you joined a very exclusive club in being an unhappy scriptwriter in California.
Yeah, there are very few in California.
William Faulkner and Francis Scott Fitzgerald were big flops as screenwriters.
Well, Francis Fitzgerald drank himself to death at Musso and Frank's on Hollywood Boulevard. And William Faulkner had this very fun thing in which years ago I became very interested in William Faulkner, his adventures in Hollywood. So I would trace them. And he had an affair with Howard Hawks' secretary. He lived in Oxford, Mississippi. And he was writing his fiction there, and his sales were very weak, so he couldn't feed his family with his fiction. And so every once in a while, because Howard Hawks liked him, he gave him an assignment, saying, why don't you come to Hollywood for a few months, make some money, and then you go back to write your art shit. And he would go gladly. So in all these trips, he started having an affair with Howard Hawks' secretary, which was then later made a caricature. I don't know if you know the movie Barton Fink by the Coen brothers. There's an allusion, there's a subplot in which you find a character that seems like an alcoholic novelist that is working and then he has an affair with the secretary of a big filmmaker or whatever. And they were having their meetings in a hotel, which is the Knickerbocker Hotel, which is just north of Hollywood Boulevard, in an area where now everything is owned by the Church of Scientology. The world has changed.
The world has changed.
The aliens landed. And nowadays, that is a residency for old people, very old people. And it's a ghostly twilight world. And in there, William Faulkner had this love affair with this lady. And everything he wrote, barely anything of what he wrote got produced. And I don't think he ever understood the business. There's an anecdote in which Howard Hawks takes him and Clark Gable on a hunting trip with a lot of big guns and big men with big guns. They're out there shooting things that move, and Clark Gable approaches Faulkner, that was kind of a short gentleman, very dapper, very well dressed, always with the Southern thing. And he goes, "And Mr. Faulkner, what is that you do?" And he said, "Well, I'm a writer." "And Mr. Gable, what is that you do?" And so he never got it. He never got Hollywood. But he made some money that allowed him to write some of these books that became very popular, and that we hope that to this day we can enjoy, which is a wonderful thing. So Hollywood can be good in that sense.
Good. Well, I was going to ask you about your work as a musician and composer, but we need to open the time for questions and answers.
We don't need to scare people with that.
No.
We already heard enough horrendous stuff and say, "So on top of that, this guy makes music, give me a break." No, don't worry.
So please use the microphones in the aisle.
People are already escaping. When you mention the music, it's like, let's run away from here. We need to get out of here.
I do have a question.
All right, how about the first question?
I hope they survive the trauma. I'm so sorry.
On the theme of Hollywood, Shadow of the Wind seems like a very visual movie. Can we hope that someone has an option on that? Will it be made into a movie?
Well, for many years, many people have wanted to do Shadow of the Wind and some of the other books into movies, and to cut a very long story short, I've always said no, I don't want to transform him into a movie. I've turned everybody down, not because I didn't, the people I most respect, I know in the film industry, wanted to do this out of good faith. They believed in the project. I told them, thank you very much. But to me, this whole cycle of books is, and this may sound a bit naive, because I could make a lot more money and make them more popular if I sold the rights or made it into a movie or a TV series. But to me, these are books about readers, about writers, about the written word, about literature, about the world of books. And I think it would be a betrayal of their nature. That's what they mean to me. And that's how, for me, the version that I want all you to experience of this story is already there. And it's being projected in the theater of your mind in the way exactly I want it.
Hello. Since I'm fond of the name Marina, I'd like to know how you chose it for your book title and character.
How do I choose the book title?
Marina.
Marina. Well, Marina is the name of a girl who's the central character in this novel. This is a story of Oscar and Marina, and they are in the 70s in a very twilight Barcelona. And this is the story. It's narrated by Oscar when he's an adult, and he remembers what happened, this coming-of-age story, and what he remembers about Marina. So it's mostly about his sense of what happened, and this kind of magical character that he discovers, and that's the name, Marina. It's not about a yachting club or something like that.
Over here.
Hi, my name is Catherine. Thank you so much for coming out today and doing this.
Thank you.
I was first introduced to your literature a few years ago reading The Shadow of Wind and the other two in the Forgotten Book series. The writing was just so beautiful and engaging. And I had the chance to go to Barcelona and see some of the places you were talking about. And every time I read these books, I'm always worried that I'm losing something in translation. So how do you ensure when your books are translated across the globe into so many beautiful languages that the essence of what you're saying isn't lost, so that those of us who read them in whatever language is still getting what you wrote.
Well, I try to work with the best possible translators. In the case of English, I work with Lucia Graves. We worked together for a long time, and we have a particular way of working in which Lucia starts working on a very rough first draft. She sends this to me, I start reworking it and rewriting it. It goes back to her, she looks at it, and we go back and forth, and then I do a final edit to make sure that a reader in English doesn't meet anything, that it's dynamic, it's the music of each sentence, the pacing, everything that is exactly a replication of what you get. In other languages, if I have some knowledge of that language, I can work more closely or not with the translator. There are cases in which I cannot help them. Sometimes I get a query, I don't know, from my Korean translator, and she comes up with a problem, and I say, baby, you're on your own. So in those cases, you have to trust them because they are good and they do their best. And one day I show up in Seoul and there are people waiting for me in the airport to throw tomatoes. So what is this piece of crap? But it has never happened. I think I've always been very fortunate in finding great translators in over 40 plus languages or so. But there, in some instances, you can tell. In some instances, you can, because you know. And there are some languages, English, for instance, from Spanish to English, it's pretty easy to travel. And then there are a few dangers along the way, but if you're aware of them, I think you can match them almost like 99.9%. And most of Romanic languages, from Spanish to French to Portuguese to Italian to many of these Romanic languages, you can always be seamless. Then there are other, for instance, Dutch, in which the structure of the language grammatically has some requirements or a structure. You need to sometimes break a sentence in two that in Spanish may be longer, or you need to decide where units of meaning go, and sometimes it's trickier in some languages. But it's one at a time, and hopefully, I think in the case of English, which probably concerns most of you fellows today, I can vouch, every single thing in there, it doesn't go to print until I've redone it a million times, so I can say this is the book I wrote, and then in some cases rewrote just for the English to make sure an English reader doesn't lose anything.
That is phenomenal. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
This gentleman?
Good afternoon. So I'd like to return to something you said earlier in your talk about how elements of the fantastic have been in storytelling ever since we could tell stories, from Greek tragedies to Renaissance, and how there's a tendency in these days, we're so sophisticated, we're almost hyper sophisticated into labeling things that have these fantastic elements into different. So I suppose my question, as a writer who may want to incorporate fantastic elements but not be labeled, is that unavoidable in order to get published, in order to get marketed?
It depends. It's a very interesting question. I remember the great American writer Gene Wolfe, which is one of the greatest fantasy writers, one day said that they asked him, what is magical realism? And he said, magical realism is fantasy written by people with Spanish names. And I think it's the best definition I've heard, and it's true. A lot of these things are publishers and booksellers and distributors. They need to find a place. When you walk into a bookstore, there's a section that says fiction, and there's a section that says mystery thriller, and another one says fantasy, and you say science fiction, horror, literature, and you're meaning what? The rest is crap then? You imply that? Or it means that this is just so boring and pretentious that just avoid it and go to the mystery section. What does it mean? So it doesn't mean anything. It's just labels, it's marketing. So depending, I think, if your use of the fantastic, it's more integrated into a naturalistic way. I think it's about the sensibility, how you use. If you really go for the genre traps, if you really want to write a sword and sorcery novel, then you're going to be labeled that. But then again, you have interesting cases in which there are writers who are always borderline. There are Ursula Le Guin, she hates that to be classified away because she feels that she's being cut off from an audience, and she's right, but it's going to happen. I think 1 or 2 years ago, the English novelist Kazuo Ishiguro wrote what would be called, a sword and sorcery novel. And he, of course, was so concerned that nobody labeled it that, saying, no, it's literary fiction. It came so strange, the whole thing. Say, dude, you wrote a story about the swords and giants and dragons and castles and fairies, so this is it. And say, no, that's not it. I think he was concerned about this labeling, about this thing, about, not being taken seriously. I think up to a point, we as readers, we have the criteria to decide what's what. And there's fantastic material published as fantasy, as horror, as noir, as mystery, as literary fiction, as whatever. So you as a reader, you just enjoy, and it's not about what's the label. The quality of a work of fiction is defined by the use of language, by the storytelling, by characterization, by the world you create, how you engage the reader, what the things you do. If it's a mystery novel, if there are detectives, if people wear guns, if there's a spaceship, if there's a monster or not, it's just people walking around in a room in Brooklyn in the 50s talking about the meaningless of existence, whatever. If it's good, it's not about that. Books are about storytelling, and what defines them is the storytelling, the language, and the craft. What they're about, what genre they can be labeled, that is just a marketing device. If you start believing in these things, you fall into a trap. And if you're a writer and you're trying to work in between the seams, or you're trying to incorporate, you're going to be labeled in some way. And sometimes for reasons that are pretty absurd. And then you may get your box of books, and you may find a dwarf with a sword and a monster behind in the cover, and you say, oh my God, who did, why? And somebody in marketing thought that was the best way to market your book, or not. Or they may find something very mysterious because it's literary fiction, so we don't really know what it is. And then you cannot tell, but there's a dwarf in the book and he has a sword and he kills monsters. Shh, shut up, it's not about that. And so, all of these preconceptions and prejudices are a bit silly, but are part of the industry or part of the business, and you just have to navigate them in the best way you can.
Okay.
Thank you.
One final brief question.
Shadow of the Wind and so many of your books are odes to books and stories and literary lovers, and so I was just wondering if you could name a couple titles or authors that you love or serve as sources of inspiration to you.
Well, there's a writer I admire profoundly who I had the chance to meet today and talk to in the hallways here. Who's Joyce Carol Oates. Joyce Carol Oates, I think, is a genius, is one of the greatest living writers today, and she's one of my favorite authors.
She's our Balzac.
It's incredible how she manages to be so prolific and produce this level of quality. This is an example of I have a very wide range of interests and tastes. For instance, I think one of the best writers of the last 50 years is John le Carré, just for his work in the language and characterization as a storyteller. And I say, well, it's because, and I don't see him as a spy novelist or something like that. He's a novelist, he's a prodigious writer. He just happens to tell stories in which sometimes there are spies and international intrigue. There are many, I'm very interested in the work of some of the 19th century great writers that we mentioned, Dickens, Dumas, and company. I'm also very interested in a lot of noir writers from the golden age of noir, from the Raymond Chandler, the Ross MacDonalds, on all of that, to many contemporary noir writers, which I think are doing tremendous job, the generation of the Dennis Lehane, George Pelecanos, people like that. I love Stephen King, which today was here and blessing us with his presence, which I think is one of the greatest storytellers of all time. I think he's a modern day Dickens, and he's also a prodigious writer. There are a lot of very different things. I try to read without prejudice, without paying attention what things are labeled, if this is because this is commercial or this is not commercial. I find a lot of these labels downright silly, if not perverse at some point, to try to discriminate certain things. And what I do, my test is I pick up something and I read half a page, or the first page, or page at random. If you are right there, if you're in the hands of somebody who knows their craft, if the language works, if there's something there, it's in the texture of the work. If something is well done, I don't care what's the genre, what it's about. That's not what I'm going to enjoy. What I'm going to enjoy is good work. And then I want to be taking on a ride. I don't know. You tell me the story, whatever that is, and take me to another world. And I think that's the most, to me, the best way to approach anything. So, I could go on and on about writers and things that I'm interested in. And I'm hoping to continue discovering new writers. There are a lot of people out there working hard, creating great things. So keep an open mind and go for it.
Thank you,
Thank
Carlos
you.
Ruiz Zafón.
Thank you so much.
A real pleasure.
Thank you.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.